Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I never come back. Marcus, why am I singing about ball games?
Because you probably think you're Bill Murray or something like that.
No, because today is a podcast doubleheader. We're doing 2 recordings on the same day.
Yeah, and you're talking to a German living in the UK, not a US citizen.
Right, okay, so that's lost on you. So enough about baseball. Tell us who's on the show.
Well, today we're talking to Cindy Suarez and her book, The Power Manual, which is a lot about power dynamics in all sorts of contexts, but obviously you're going to look a little bit more into a business and team perspective. So super interesting conversation. However, what were your takeaways?
So it was a really good conversation, and she said a couple of things. One of which she said that, the ability to have power is about grace. And I tell you, she has a huge amount of grace. So that really came through during our conversation today. But my takeaways is I was talking about a personal story that you'll hear about when you listen to the podcast. And she's like, you can indeed change the rules by changing your behavior, and other people will notice. So it's not about trying to actively go out and tell people you're going to change the rules. You can behave your way into changing the rules, and other people will notice. I thought that was really, really insightful and very true. And the other thing is, I've got a long-running thing that I don't say truth and I don't say facts anymore. I talk about data. And it seems like it was a little bit of a lightning rod for her, because she's seen data in yet another context where data is being used to either support or to confront power. And I think it's a really interesting additional angle that we brought into the conversation. But what were your takeaways today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the data thing, we like to think of data being neutral, but I think recently there's been documentaries about that already, that, it is maybe for a split second when it's collected, and afterwards, when we start dealing with it, using it, it becomes something quite non-neutral. Yeah, the thing you mentioned earlier as well is sort of why first take. And I like the fact about, I'm currently in a project. It's a lot about new processes. And she says, well, the processes actually don't bring the change. It's the behavior, right? So changing behavior is what gets us out of the standard into the new. And I think that's really the thing. If you look at it, there's so many companies who invest in technologies and tools and processes and redefining and reorg structure things. Nowhere is behavior. Even so, the behavior of the people inside of all these artificial structures is probably what's going to make the difference. And she's like, well, if you want to bring change, bring a different behavior, stick to it, and lead by example, and that will probably make more of a dent than anything else. The other thing I really liked is that so she's been taking a lot of, even though she has a very scientific background, and as a journalist, there's a lot of things she learned from theater and play, and how to be able to step out of what you know into the new through play. So to basically bring the power dynamics that often might be hidden out, and to explore or be brave enough to step into something new and do that through play. And I know as a designer that play is a very powerful force for people to change their mindset, look at things in a new way, and so on. So, in the last part of her book, there's a couple of plays she's listing and describing that one can do with teams and otherwise to really get into very different dynamics and to expose toxic dynamics and do something about it. And it's brilliant. So I really loved those very practical ideas and actions on that.
Yeah, go on.
However, that's us. Unless you want to add something to it, we might
No. What I wanted to say was, rather than playing games, why don't we go and listen to her and her brilliant interview?
There you go. You got the better wordplay. You got the better metaphors. Let's go there. Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencastr. We use Zencastr for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencastr is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code WICKED I repeat, WICKED Podcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hello everyone, today we're here with Cindy Suarez. Hello Cindy, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Hi Marcus, thanks for having me.
Yeah, lovely. So we usually start at the top, as always, and so please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
Well, my name is Cindy Suarez. Currently, I am the president and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit Quarterly, which is a journal in the United States, but pretty much read worldwide from what I understand, and it focuses on civil society, social movements, nonprofits, foundations, everything in that realm. And I've always been fascinated with power. Growing up in Boston, in Black neighborhood of Roxbury, and Boston's a very stratified city. And I don't know. I guess I've always been really interested in how people interact in the different neighborhoods. The different levels of access and comfort for people to move throughout the city. And I started to read a lot of theory when I was in my teenage years and went to grad school for it. So I guess I've always, in a way, studied it. And I always knew I would write a book about it. And also my spiritual practice, which is all about, it's an Eastern-based practice. So there's a lot there about, self, supremacy and discipline as part of liberation. So I just think it's something that I've always been surrounded by. And when I finally felt like it was time, I sat down a few years ago and wrote the book. And it was quite an experience to kind of get all of that thinking and make sense of it for myself. And I've been really happy to see that other people have gotten something out of it as well.
Yeah,
I wrote it for
definitely.
myself to understand, finally all these things that I had experienced and studied. So
Yeah, it's writing a book is quite a self-filtering process, isn't it? Just to get some thoughts in order and whatnot. And it's a really great book. We're here having a bit of a more business angle on things, but in the end, we're talking about people, groups of people coming together, trying to achieve something, and obviously, power dynamics always play a big role, especially when you talk about change and transformation. And so let's start with let's start with talking a little bit about the dynamics between power and how to change it, and in particular there about behavioral change and power and what the dynamics there is. What's your views on that? Let's start over there.
yeah, for me, it's central. I think understanding it and knowing how to move through it, it's such a big topic, but I think no matter what you do, you're always kind of balancing your right to whatever it is that you want with other people's. So everything really has that kind of interaction where you have to think about that. And, and I think for the most part, from what I understand, most of us live in pretty stratified societies. So that adds another level of that. And so when people are trying to change something about their society to make it more fair, more thriving, more whatever, that's usually one of the central things to look at. Power determines who makes the rules, who can change them, what the norms are in a system. It's just, to me, the most integrated way to think about social change. And from many angles. In my book, I talk about it at different levels. And I think if I were to summarize it, there is the personal part of it, your own story about how much power you have. It's really fascinating to see that even though society ascribes power to people, people also have their own sense of power. And sometimes that's in conflict or that's something to mitigate. So there's a lot at the personal level, how we grow up to think that we can have what we want in the world. And then there is interpersonal, which I mentioned earlier, when we interact with other people. And then there's systems that we all are part of and enact through norms. And so it's just a fascinating, endless topic of study, especially for people who care about change, who care about having a certain kind of culture.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we had a couple of months ago, I think we had a conversation about governance and about politics and those kind of dynamics as well, which sometimes entail an aspect of power and sometimes not. And so when we look at that, for example, again, probably organizational, and you probably have everyone's come across dealing with organizations, groups of people that have established power systems, who you're allowed to talk to, who not, how you talk to people, and so on. At some point, we're normally getting into a state where we have established processes. And some people talk about processes, some people talk about behaviors. They're different things, right? Can you explain a bit from your perspective of where the differences are between, there's a behavior, established behavior, but sometimes behaviors and processes live next to each other, and sometimes they're separate.
Yeah, I mean,
Do
I
you see
think,
a connection there?
yeah, well, I think the way that I think about that is that we always have choice around how we choose to interact or to respond to anything. And so obviously systems have processes and, sometimes not so clear, but just sort of implied, biases and ways that people are expected, even what's considered good or professional, all of that is very, determined and chosen by someone at some point, whether explicitly or implicitly. So I do think that, and I think I guess I wonder the extent to which people have to negotiate that. I know for people who are not always at, there or part of the culture that creates those norms, oftentimes we have to negotiate those. We have to either, buy into them and learn how to act those out, oftentimes with challenges to our sense of self, or, at the other end, challenge those. For me, one of the things I learned through writing the book and through my own exploration of power for decades is that I think of true power as graceful. I think of it as an art form almost to learn how to negotiate. There are people who don't have a lot of space to even question, and there are people who have a hard time being part of what exists, right? So there's always a lot there. It's a lot for someone. And if you think about that space of choice around how we react to things, that's almost like a world in itself at every moment. So I actually think of people as having a lot of power, no matter how they're positioned in society. And for me, what I've noticed is that a lot of it has to do with imagination. If you can imagine yourself having power. For me, even as someone who studied power, I constantly find ways that I'm limiting myself just by what I think or assume unquestioned. So I just think of that as a really exciting exploration.
So that's there's a whole lot wrapped up in there, and I'm going to kind of pull out a few of those things. I'm going to wrap it in this idea of power when it comes to competition, and I'm going to tell a story of my own. So back in 1989, 1990, I was in sales, and I was a young guy, and I was out there. I was born on 4,000 acres of farmland in the middle of Missouri, so generally kind of good, what I consider to be morals and values. And I was out there selling computer systems. And I was selling against other people who played by different rules, who didn't have the same kind of ethos that I did. When I said my computer system could do X, Y, and Z, I knew it could do X, Y, and Z. When they said it would do X, Y, and Z, it was because that was exactly what the customer wanted, and then figure out how to manage their expectations when it didn't do that later. Mm-hmm. And I struggled for a very, very long time. And even today, I find myself like, I'm not playing by the same set of rules, and I can't compete, and I feel less powerful because I won't twist myself. I won't twist my ethics to play by their rules. What would you make of that story?
That's really interesting. I totally relate to that. I think that, and I think this is where our choice and how we choose to be in a system gives us a lot of room. But I think that our ability to, in my book, there are a few chapters on game theory, because that's actually one of the most explicit ways to actually think about power in ways that people can practice, and kind of, it makes a lot of those dynamics explicit. And I love how game theory folks list the different levels of a game. The highest level of a game, or sort of like the most powerful level, is when you can determine the game and the rules and invite who gets to play, right? So you get to determine the game happens. that all the way down to, you can change the rules of the game, because rules are always being changed. And we talk about things, rules and norms as being established, but they never quite are. They're always in a state of flux, right? There's some aspect of it that remains, constant perhaps, but I do think of that as being in flux. And at the total bottom of the game, I think there are about 7 levels, is you can choose whether or not to participate in the game. And that's when you have the least power. Even if you have no power in a game, you can decide to participate or not. Sometimes you have to be there and you're not participating silently. I've been in systems where I've shifted the rules of the game in a very nuanced way. And this goes back to what I said before about grace, right? When I guess the way I look at it in a system, the person who has the most integrity kind of wins. Maybe that's not true in all systems, but I do think that there is something about that. When I've done it, when I've seen, and all these things that happen in business, or in corporations also happen in nonprofits, there actually isn't a lot of difference, or there aren't a lot of differences around these things. There isn't an alternative way of being in a nonprofit. So a lot of the stories are similar. When you say that, I can tell you many stories like that, where I've gone into a system and I've been in systems that are toxic. And I've decided, I'm going to play in a system because it's the only opportunity I have to get to this other place I want to get to. And while I'm here, I'm not going to. So I was in a system where I was ascribed high status and invited to be toxic to other people of lower status. So it happens in many ways. And I think for people, that's even maybe an even more challenging dynamic, because you have to choose not to do that when you can, and sort of show a different integrity. And when I did that, I was actually really surprised that everyone noticed and everyone else started to act differently. And then pretty soon, within a year or two, that culture had changed dramatically. I think when things like that happen, what I notice is that most people are not very comfortable challenging directly, or have the experience or skills or comfort in intervening gracefully. You don't always have to say, hey, I don't like this. No, you can just not be part of something and do something different that shows a different way of being. What I've seen is that people notice. We are very attuned to notice what each other does and how much integrity we have. And, I've actually seen that, so that I've had sometimes eventually more power than the person above me that has created the toxic culture, because there's something about people that follows who they think has the most integrity. Now, maybe that doesn't happen everywhere. Maybe it takes a level of practice and skill. I've been doing this for a long time, and I feel like each job I've had gives me like the next challenge level. So I'm always kind of really, because I've made this my sort of focus in my work, and I've moved through a lot of different organizations and levels of work. I have been practicing this for a while. So I do think it's possible to be in a system and to choose freedom and liberation rather than domination as a way of being. It's not
Great
easy.
insights. Great insights.
Thank you.
How do you maybe trying to stay, because it's quite specific, and I'm currently working in a project, and we all have probably similar stories, but it's often when you come in and you have a different viewpoint, that language is just a big thing to pick, right? So and I've been in scenarios where I was given some kind of title, some kind of label, sitting around innovation or new things. It was always the new guy, very much by myself, maybe one of two people max, and the rest of the group was always doing things in an established way, established values, established processes, and you're sometimes even fighting just to be part of the conversation by means of being part of meetings and so on and so on. And then being listened to is another thing. And I always found that, and I've done this through so many different industries as well, non-profit, profit. How do you then move? Have you been in a context there when you had to move from maybe your very own language into that language, and sort of to shift your perception without losing your identity, essentially, because you're bringing a new viewpoint and you want to tell the story in your way that can be understood, but sometimes the mindset just isn't there in the other group, so you have to rely on different language. Can you tell us a bit
That's
more
a
about that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marcus, because I actually think language is central to this. And in my situation, or in my case, I can only speak from my experience, I have always had people notice that I don't use the same language they use. People notice these things, like I said. For example, in a lot of social change work, there's a lot of language around oppression, around people situate themselves in systems as powerless. And there's a lot of, the struggle. There's a lot of ideology and language that people actually watch out for. And if you don't use that language, you become suspect unless you have an alternative, more coherent language. And so I give talks a lot, about different parts of my work, my book, and even to this day, people always notice that I use different language. And that's how I noticed that language was an issue, because it was such an issue for other people that I wasn't using the language that they expected me to use. I think the role of a leader is, a central skill is translation. And so language becomes central, and I use language very carefully. And I don't usually change my language to match the group. Something about different language invites people into a different realm. I don't know. It's just me. And to this day, it's just something, and I'm always explaining certain words. A lot of my writing is about why I don't use this word or use that word. And it's just a lot, a lot. So yeah, that's just my experience. I think of language as kind of like the currency that allows you to travel.
But it really is like, because I remember, I've been in the UK now for 21 years, coming from Germany. So I'm literally been using 2 different languages for big parts of my life. And that gives you already an idea that because it's not just language itself, what's attached to words often are images and stories that go way deeper and are more ingrained in a lot of assumptions. The second you switch them, is actually really powerful, because you suddenly start to consider very different things, sometimes literally the other side of an argument, the other side of a story and a fact. Going back to, some of those movies and stories when, there's 3, 4 travelers and something happens and everyone has a different view of exactly the same story, just to show the power of language and different perspective. So I'm being this for a while. Maybe just wanted to further comment on that. Like, it's interesting that it can exist in 2 different words in the same language in different contexts, as much as, on the big scale, you have literally 2 different languages as a person in different countries. And there you have either bigger differences, but also sometimes actually amazing similarities where across cultures people are using the same thing. So it's absolutely a fascinating part. But I'll let Troy ask the next question.
So again, let's talk 2 languages, but instead of let's talk, English versus German, let's talk data versus emotion. I think that's such a huge thing that I'm seeing over and over and over again, that people are using highly charged emotional kind of language, emotive language, to get people to either come with or to go against them. And somebody comes along with some reasonably well thought out rational data, and it's the dead cat bounce. It's like it goes absolutely nowhere. So how do you look at power when it comes to language of emotion versus data?
Wow. There's a lot in what you guys are saying. I think even data to me is a language. Data isn't always straightforward either, right? And I
tell people I'm no longer using truth or facts. I only use the word data because data needs source and context.
Well, that's interesting. I actually have a different, I guess a lot of data, at least in the US, is so biased, and a lot of even data collecting systems and algorithms are biased. So data has become so not, and even facts, right? Like, it's so much, I think we are, part of being human is expanding so you can hold more complexity. And we are in such a state of complexity that I feel almost like our language and our ways of being are adjusting to that. Multiple worlds. Like I think of, for example, Deleuze and Guattari, they talk about lines of flight, right? I use that concept from their writing a lot. That even just different sets of assumptions take you in a whole different direction, even if you're doing the same thing. So language in a way is like that. And so I'm constantly paying attention to the language that I use, and not just the language, but the stories I tell myself. So I could be in a crisis, and it could also be like a great opportunity in that crisis. And I have to remind myself that it's, even though there's also a crisis, there's also like this amazing thing that could not have happened if it wasn't for this crisis. So then I start shifting my narrative about what I say, and then and so that's like a discipline that I have. So in cultures are like that as well. And I actually think of data that way too. Data in our field is actually very contentious. There's a lot of different ways of collecting data, from hardcore data to the more informal kind of like experiential based data. So yeah, in my work, data is actually a source of, it's one of those front lines of contesting power. There is a group, the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, that a colleague of mine runs, and they've done so much work on they have just totally blown up this idea of data and evaluation and how it's used in our sector. Because if the ultimate result from using that is that it recreates inequities, which is the result, then we are really looking at what does it mean that we're using this data and getting the same results as when we're using different kinds of data? Is there something about the way we're using data, who thinks what something is data and what's not data? So I don't know. There's a lot there. I think we're in a moment of trying to determine truth. And as someone who has a teenager who has grown up in this time, I understand the risks of young people who grow up now, not really, like my son will see something and think it's true. And I go, no, actually, where did you get that? And he'll say, oh, a YouTuber who's really like a great influencer said that. And so I'm constantly, and both my partner and I are journalists, so we're constantly having conversations about what's true and what's not. And it's not so simple. And yet, again, in Vedic scriptures, I mean, you think about, more like the ancient truths that continue to be truths, they actually do speak of truth as something to discern. And so I think of it as actually part of almost like a spiritual practice, and it's not at all simple.
So I am, I don't know if you know it or not, but Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which are part of Voice of America.
I've heard of it.
Them? So Prague had a conference just last week, and I was talking about how blockchain can be used to fight censorship, and looking at data from all of that, and the internet shutdowns that are happening, and the authoritarian levels of power that are being asserted over entire nations, and the struggle of the people within those. And for a guy who typically goes to tech conferences or does a lot of business speak, to be surrounded by journalists who are really out there working on the front lines against authoritarian regimes was really, really interesting. So lots of respect for journalists, especially in that particular space. And as you say, data can be very contentious, sometimes on one side, but sometimes it's hiding the data away from the people because it threatens the regime. So it's right. Very interesting.
Yeah, we have those conversations here. We had where people are looking to have systems like that for how work gets funded and how money gets directed from government. And people have actually talked about, interestingly enough, blockchain data tracking as a way to really make this information or these kind of transactions more public. And also people are looking for data to move outside of organizations into the public. So those are kind of how it shows up in our work as well.
Yeah. And as usual, we have more questions than time, so I already have to start slowly going into probably our last question, which might be a big one. There's a lot of plays and activities you explain in sort of the last part of the book that look into power dynamics and deal with them and expose them sometimes in groups and join them. Can you tell us a little bit about exactly that? Because it feels like a very practical way of actually bringing these things out. And so tell us a bit more on how you do them and how they work and what they do, please.
Yeah, that's actually something I learned in the process of writing the book. And I have a daughter, my oldest, who just graduated from Yale with a degree in theater and film. And as a theater kid, and as a mom taking her to different events, and just as she developed in that, when I was writing the book, she was doing a series of advanced studies, and it's when I realized that in theater, being able to change your status at will was considered to be the sign of mastery, right? So there are certain stars that always play low status role or high status roles. Usually stars play high status roles. So even if they're playing a low status character, they'll play it in a high status way. And so the ability to change your status means that there's actually in theater a lot of practice and a lot of frameworks and theories about how to do that. How does a person that has low status in a group behave? How do they walk? How do they talk? How do they look? Who do they look at? How do they get looked at back? And so I always became fascinated because it was a way of moving it outside of what we were doing currently, which is having debates about it in meetings, right? So to instead be able to talk about power through games was fascinating, not just because it was explicit and theater had a whole set of games particular to that, but because when you play games with someone, even if you're competing, research on play, which I learned that there was a whole field on play, research shows that if you play a game with someone, even if you're competing, you entrain with them. You actually have to pay so much attention to them in order to play against them that you end up liking them, even if they are a competitor. So games are actually a great way to think about power and to figure out power. In addition to those, because it allows you to engage something at the intellectual, emotional, and physical. So I did an event once in New York a few years ago where we actually played games, and we had 3 tracks around power. We had games, we had semiotics, and material, where people were building things, and we had the same agenda across all 3 tracks. It was fascinating to see that the track that did the performativity, the theater-based track, moved faster through the curriculum. They moved twice as fast as everyone else. They just moved through things quicker, things that they thought they couldn't do, and they were just told, just play a game and act it out. They actually found there were lots of different options for how to respond. And that was very fascinating. The semiotics group got stuck. And so it's very interesting. I think that there's something about performativity to actually be able to enact something, which is what my book is about. That's what I discovered, that there was a deeper way of thinking about power that had to do with what you want to enact in the world. There are systems and there's history, but at every moment you decide, every choice you have, every interaction, every choice you have to make either moves you closer to it, to liberation and freedom, or away from it. So to me, all of those things collapse into that moment of choice. And it makes something that seems really abstract and ineffable very concrete if you actually can think of those systems and think about how you interact and how you choose. It puts the onus of liberation on ourselves, even though there are systems. I was in London a few years ago doing a talk with NHS on my book, and it was the leaders of the system, and they all felt pretty powerless. So system is a very mystifying term and concept. People think that it's something external that they cannot change, even when they're the leaders of that system. So thinking about things as something that you get to enact the system that you're part of, or you can change it. So for me, the idea of this makes my language around what happens to me less about how powerless I am, given okay, this is it's almost like a chessboard. Okay, this is the chess. This is how it's laid out. What are the openings? There's always openings. There's always a place where you have power. Find it and move there. That's how I've been. That's how I've been doing it so far.
That's wonderful, and I think it's especially with these things coming from theater and the acting out, playing out. Again, we had another guest where we talked about role playing as well as a part of service design and problem solving, and I think generally just the acting on things and just standing up and going like, okay, let's play this through. What does that mean?
It really changes you.
Yeah, it's so powerful. You suddenly realize that actually the concept that you think restricts you is just in your head.
Exactly.
It is not existing in reality, right? The second you go, you know what? We go there, we knock on the door, we go there, we go out. And I remember in advertising agencies pulling creatives out into shops. It's like, go, interact, do it yourself. See how it actually feels. Because you're stuck in this hypothetical world thinking you can't do it. It's like, that makes no sense. And I'm always fascinated by things with, how contexts really, really, really push us into these corners. People getting into their car and suddenly there's road rage. It makes no sense. The second they step out of it, it's gone because they suddenly become someone else. So these kind of thresholds into standing up, just doing something is amazingly powerful. And I think therefore the play aspect of just doing these things and forgetting a bit about this theoretical threat, this theoretical powerlessness that you have, is a great way to bust it. So
Exactly.
thank you so much for all these insights. There's so much more we couldn't get to talk about. We got a much more longer list of questions as usual. It's a really great book with a lot of really good core principles in it that I was reading. I was like, oh my god, yes, of course, that's a great way of saying this, great way of understanding it, that more easily lets you move on and activate things. So thank you, Cindy, so much for your time and being with us.
Thank you for having me, Marcus and Troy. This has been great.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.